Thanks, Ashley. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this evening's NASET webinar. It's the titled The Latest on Federal Oversight, Administration, and Enforcement of Special Education Protections, presented by the co-authors of Special Education and the Law. I'm Dr. Eric Oxford. I'm a former special education director in Massachusetts. I'm the co-founder of the Inclusive Practice and Pulse for Education, which is a workforce intelligence platform for special education. I'm also a proud NASET partner, and I'm honored to be kicking things off tonight. If you're new to NASET, our members receive free access to webinars like this one, along with expert-led training, exclusive resources, and discounts on our professional development certifications. I encourage you all to check it out. Lots of great resources. And tonight we are privileged to welcome back Dr. Allan G. Osborne and Dr. Charles J. Russo, co-authors of Special Education and the Law. They'll discuss the latest developments in federal agency oversight, administration, and enforcement of special education protections, as well as the important questions this announced shift raises for the people doing the daily work of serving students with disabilities, just like each and every one of you here today. With that, Dr. Osborne and Dr. Russo, thank you so much for being here. It is truly a privilege for all of us, and I will turn it over to you.
Thanks for the opportunity to be here, Eric. And Alan's going to start us off.
Hey, and it's a privilege to be back again with such a great group. Being a former special ed teacher myself, I have great affinity for all special ed teachers, and I understand what all of you are going through and the anguish you must feel at the moment. I think I'd like to start things off by saying that Charlie and I don't have all the answers. With what's going on in Washington right now, we're trying to figure it out ourselves, but we're going to try today to help you figure out what's going on and perhaps what it is you ought to do. We have a brief PowerPoint presentation, and then after that, we'll take questions and we will try to answer the questions that we are able to. Let me start by sharing my screen here. Oops, I'm not at the first slide. Here we are. Okay, we thought that it might be helpful if we spend a few minutes just going through the history of the current U.S. Department of Education and the Office of Special Ed Programs. Our purpose in doing that is if you see where we've come from, I think it might not be as scary in terms of where we're going. At least I hope it won't be for you. The Department of Ed has its history dating back to shortly after the Civil War, back in 1867. Before then, as those of you who were at our last webinar will know, that education is predominantly a function of the states. And prior to the Civil War, it was almost totally an education, a function of the states. The federal government had very little to do with education. But in 1867, the federal government created a Department of Education. And its sole purpose was really to collect educational statistics and information. But about a year later, because people expressed a lot of concerns about federal control, they were afraid that the federal government was attempting to totally take over education. So Congress reduced its status from a department to an office and became the Office for Education. From about 1868 to 1953, in other words, shortly after the Second World War, it continued to operate primarily as a research and information agency. And in that respect, it collected data on schools and educational practices. But there wasn't any particular physical location where you could go to for an Office of Education. It was housed within several federal departments, and it kind of shuffled around a little bit, so it never really had a home.
If I could just add something in there before we get to the GI Bill. 1954, the most important case in the history of the United States Supreme Court, of course, is Brown v. Board of Education. It opened an era of equal educational opportunities that honestly was still waiting to be materialized fully. but it eventually opened the door, as Alan's going to talk in a few moments about some of these other bills, leading ultimately to the adoption of what we now call the IDEA. Education, as Alan said, there's a 1973 Supreme Court case we didn't cite here called San Antonio versus Rodriguez on the topic of school funding. And the Supreme Court said explicitly, education, of course, is not among the rights afforded explicit protection in the United States Constitution, nor do we find any reason to say it is so protected. However, with a really big but, Brown opened up the door by saying that if a state provides a benefit, it must provide that benefit to all people on an equal basis. And that's how we began to get greater involvement with the federal government in educational matters, particularly at the Supreme Court, although it began to develop in the 50s, as Alan will just point out now.
Okay, as you can see from the slide up here, starting in the 1950s, extending to the 70s, several bills were passed by Congress that brought the federal government more into the process of education and into the business of education. But what I want to focus on mostly, though, is the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. First of all, most of you probably know that. It's had various names over the years, but that was a precursor to No Child Left Behind and Every Student Succeeds. But the important part of that in terms of special education was that's what Title I has come from. Title I is part of the ESEA. And of course, Title I, it's not special education, but it is an act or a program that provides services for students who are disadvantaged. Also during this time, there were many civil rights and disability laws that increased federal responsibilities. Particularly, of course, we know IDEA and also Section 504. Now, the modern department, as it once was up until recently, was created in 1979 under a piece of legislation known as the Department of Education Organization Act. That was something that was very much supported by Jimmy Carter when he was running for president. And one of his campaign promises was that he would create a cabinet-level Department of Education. And after he took office, Congress passed that legislation, and the department came into existence and began operations in 1980. At that time, all education functions were transferred into the Department of Education, most of them coming from what was then known as Health, Education, and Welfare, which is now known as Health and Human Services. Okay, what was the purpose of the department? Well, one of its main purposes, and this is where Title I came in, is to promote equal educational opportunity. They were to coordinate all federal education programs. The department was supposed to support state and local education efforts and improve education through research and information sharing. And what it did not do, oops, I've lost my place here. What it did not do at that time in particular is it did not create any kind of a national curriculum. Okay, the major responsibilities the department has today is to administer federal education funding. It manages student aid programs, enforces education and civil rights laws, conducts research, collects statistics. If you go on the Department of Education website, if you're ever looking for any kind of statistics at all, the statistics they have on that website are massive. Okay, it supported programs for disadvantaged students and students with disabilities. And in that respect, it oversees the implementation of the IDEA, as you all know. Also, under Section 504, it supports protections for students with disabilities. And in general, it just reflects a federal commitment to educational equity and access. Now, we've mentioned a little bit about the federal involvement in special education, but I think at this time, I'd like to take a few minutes to just take a little step backwards now and show how that has been tied into the Department of Education. Okay. Now going back to 1966, which is before the Elementary and Secondary Education Act was even passed. Okay. It added Title VI, which helped to establish local special education grants. In 1967, okay, the Bureau of Education for the Handicapped was formally created in the U.S. Office of Education. And at that time, we all referred to students with disabilities as handicapped students. As you all know, the language has been changed over the years. The BEH, the first director that was appointed was a gentleman named Dr. James Gallagher. And for me, that's a significant name because when I was a college student studying special education in the 70s, early 70s, the leading textbook at the time was written by two people. One was Sam Kirk, and the second co-author was Jim Gallagher. And that was the standard for years. They are both no longer with us. A couple other authors have taken over that textbook, and it's still in existence today. In terms of overall impact, the BEH coordinated early federal disability initiatives before special education was even federally mandated, so before the IDEA.
If I could just intercede a little bit, Alan.
Yep, jump in.
When the IDEA was introduced as the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, I have to recognize that there was a great deal of dissatisfaction with the way kids with disabilities were treated. Pardon me for reading something at you, but how would you react as a parent, let alone as an educator, if a child was excluded from school, quote, for being weak-minded and, quote, because his physical condition and ailment produced a depressing and nauseating effect upon the teachers and school children? That quote comes from a case that we didn't put up here, State versus Board of Education of the City of Antigua from Wisconsin in 1919. So the Supreme Court of Wisconsin allowed a child with special needs to be excluded solely on the basis of his physical condition and ailment. Much later, 1958, the Supreme Court of Illinois ruled, quote, that existing legislation does not require the state to provide a free education program as part of the common school system for the feeble-minded or mentally deficient children who, because of limited intelligence, are unable to receive a good common school education. That's 1958. That's amazing that those attitudes were shared. I grew up in New York City as a product of Catholic education, but I had many friends who went to public schools, and New York City had what they called the 600 schools, if I remember the number correctly. They basically warehoused children with disabilities. Kids with disabilities were in schools, but they really received very little education. And a statistic we decided not to put up on the board or the PowerPoint, but let me read this at you again, then Alan will take over again. As of July 1, 1974, a year before this Education for All Handicapped Children Act was adopted, 78.5% of all children in the United States with disabilities, about 8,150,000, received varying levels of education. 47.8% of the children received what today would be considered a free, appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. But 30.7% did not receive any of what we would call today related services, and 21.5% in 1975, after I graduated college, were completely excluded from any educational services. And we're talking about the United States after we landed people on the moon. And I see a commentator read her brother was hard of hearing, so he didn't go to a Catholic school, where he should have at least been given an accommodation under Section 504. And I can't tell you, Angela, how many experiences I've had teaching educators from Catholic schools and other faith-based schools. I myself am still a Catholic, who are not aware that 504 requires them to provide some services to kids. And it breaks my heart. It's almost a crusade to try to make people in the faith-based schools realize they are in fact covered by Section 504. Maybe we could talk about that in some of the Q&A. Let me give it back to Allan right now with the history of it here before we move forward. I hope that responds at least in part to Angela. If not, please feel free to comment again on the bottom.
You know, what Charlie said is really great in terms of understanding where we've come from. It's so important because I started teaching the year that Massachusetts implemented their own special education laws. And prior to that, almost all students with any kind of serious disabilities were totally excluded from education in the state of Massachusetts, as well as in all other states. But up until preceding the passage of the Education for All Handicapped Children Act in 1975, which didn't take effect until 1977, a few states, maybe a half a dozen states, had special education laws that were fairly comprehensive. As I think back, the Massachusetts law that came in when I started teaching was very much like the Education for All Handicapped Children Act. And I know people in Massachusetts like to claim that our state law was the model for the EHCA. I'm not sure that's necessarily true. We like to brag about things like the Red Sox and the Patriots and that sort of thing, but all that we brag about isn't necessarily true. So, but what the EAHCA mandated was a free, appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment for all students with disabilities. A principle came about known as zero reject. It didn't matter how severe a child's disabilities were, that child was entitled to an education. But this act also substantially expanded the role of the Bureau of Education for the Handicapped and their mandate to monitor state compliance and administer an infrastructure for the provision of services. So, as we said, in 1979, the Department of Education was organized. At that particular point, the Bureau of Education for the Handicapped was dismantled, but restructured into the Office for Special Education Programs, or OSEP, within the Department of Education. And it was placed, it's actually a sub-department under another department known as the Office of Special Education and Rehabilitative Services, which is probably a little more than you need to know at this point. Okay? But in the era of IDEA, as we mentioned, it was originally known as the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, but in 1990, the act was amended and renamed more appropriately to the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. There are also a couple of major amendments in 1997 and again in 2004 that shifted the focus toward accountability, towards transition services, inclusion of students with disabilities in any kind of state assessments. And the mission of the Office of Special Ed Programs was really solidified around tracking compliance, research to practice initiatives, and also personnel development. And the core mandate of OSEP basically was to administer billions of dollars in formula grants to the states. And that comes under two different parts. Part B is for school age and Part C for infants and toddlers. And the formula grants basically are based on your student populations more than anything else, but also they issued a number of discretionary grants, which were funds for technical assistance, research, parent training sessions, and other such things. Again, the accountability continued. The OSEP currently monitors the national implementation data. It reports annually to Congress to protect the civil rights for eligible individuals ages 0 to 21.
If I could just add again, Alan, the IDEA in its two most recent iterations, going back to 1975 even, promises to pay 40% of the excess cost associated with special education. It's never provided more than about 10 or 12%. and 25% of that goes off the top to the State Department of Education when it comes into various jurisdictions. So many have made the argument, not very successfully, that the IDA is basically an unfunded federal mandate. And a mutual friend of both Allan and myself originally began his career before becoming an academic practicing law in Alaska, where he represented school districts that went bankrupt trying to meet their IDA obligations. The IDA is a good law. Nobody could argue that, not to say it can't be made better. But Congress grossly underfunds it, and it creates situations where we often have to rob Peter to pay Paul. School systems have to reach into general funds, and nobody wants to deny regular ed students or special ed students. But on one of my exams that I give in the law school, one of my true false questions is true or false. The IDEA confers greater educational rights on kids with disabilities than on their peers who are not disabled. And the answer I'm looking for is true. The IDEA was designed to remedy generations of poor services for kids with disabilities. And it's like the pig with wings. It looks great on paper, but I'm not sure it gets off the ground because it does not provide adequate funding for states to provide to local school boards. So accountability is one thing, and we all certainly celebrate the need for that, but somebody's got to help pay the bills. Back to you, Allan. And as a former director of special ed, you could probably tell lots of stories how you didn't have the money to do things you wanted.
Except that not having the money wasn't always an option. You had to do it anyways. You had to find a way. Now, what's going on today? Well, breaking up is hard to do. We understand that. I think in showing the history, what we want to show you, or we're trying to show, is that what's going on is it's sort of a, the movie Back to the Future. I look at this as we're going forward to the past. It's bringing us back to where we were before the Department of Education existed, where the functions of education were very often split up among many different departments. Is this a good thing? No, it's not a good thing, not at all. But at least the way I feel is it's not necessarily a total disaster. It doesn't mean that there will be no federal involvement in special education or education in general. Well, let's take a look at some of the changes that we know about. And this is what's kind of problematic, is that there's a lot going on, and you get mixed messages out of Washington. So we're not always exactly sure what's going to happen. But let's look at why it's happening. For one thing, President Trump campaigned on a promise of moving education back to the states and stated he had a goal of closing the Department of Education. And the problem he has is that Congress created the Department of Education. Only Congress can dismantle the Department of Education. It can't be done by executive order. However, what can be done and is being done is that many of the major functions of the Department of Education and the Office for Special Education Programs can be more or less dismantled and redistributed to other federal agencies. And that's what we see is taking place at the moment through executive order and other mechanisms. So what we're hearing right now is that the Office of Special Education Programs and oversight for the IDEA is going to be transferred to the Department of Health and Human Services. Okay. Now, right now, the Office of Special Ed and Rehabilitative Services oversees roughly $15 billion in federal special education funding. Is that funding going to be transferred over to Health and Human Services? Will it still be there for special education? We hope so. But at this point, I can't say that there's any guarantee that it will be. Now, the Office of Civil Rights within the Department of Education is being transferred over to the Department of Justice. Okay, the Department of Justice currently has an Office for Civil Rights that enforces protections against discrimination based on race, sex, religion, and disability outside of the realm of education. the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights handles any discrimination claims within the realm of education. Okay, what are the arguments for doing what the Trump administration is doing? Well, the administration officials argue that these changes will reduce federal micromanagement. It also claims it will align responsibilities with agencies best positioned to handle them. For example, the theory is that the Department of Justice is in a better position to handle complaints of discrimination. It will improve efficiency by consolidating related functions. And now what are the arguments on the other side? Well, there are a number of civil rights and disability rights groups that are claiming that such moves will create confusion for families and schools. It risks weaker enforcement of the IDEA and civil rights protections. It can fragment responsibilities across agencies, reducing coordination. And the bottom line is it can disproportionately harm students with disabilities, multilingual learners, low-income students, and rural communities. So what's the bottom line here? Well, if oversight for the IDEA does move to HHS and Section 504 goes over to the Department of Justice, I think the biggest effects are going to be weaker, slower, and less consistent enforcement. It could be fragmentation of responsibilities across agencies. It could be harder for families to know where to go for help. There may be reduced federal pressure on states to comply, and less specialized expertise in disability-specific education law. Well, one thing I'm concerned about is, as I mentioned, DOJ, Department of Justice, has its own Office of Civil Rights. In 2025, they had over 2,700 discrimination complaints pending. I don't know if anyone would like to make a guess at all as to how many of those were resolved. Well, the answer is 0. Absolutely none. They did not resolve a single disability case, or I should say disability discrimination case in 2025. So I don't see this as being something that's going to be very positive. In terms of IDEA oversight, as I mentioned, we're going to see a loss of education-specific expertise. As of now, since 2025, approximately half of the Department of Education staff has left, either because of layoffs, retirements, or other moves where people have left the agency for other jobs, whatever. So the staffing is way down, specifically specialized staff. Many of these people are gone. I'm hoping, I think we can maybe even assume that some Department of Ed staff will transfer over to these other agencies because they're going to need more people to handle the additional responsibilities. But are the people there going to be educational experts? We're not sure. Now, another concern is that a lot of the expertise in Department of Health and Human Services follows a medical or a therapeutic model, not an education model. These people aren't experts in education law, right? So there's going to be less rigorous monitoring, I think, of state compliance, less understanding of instructional access, curriculum, and school-based services. And again, there'll be a shift towards more of a medical model of disability rather than an educational access model. And I personally, I don't mean to be political here, but I have some serious concerns about the person who's heading up Health and Human Services right now and his ideas about disability and special education. I don't think I have to go into detail about that. I think you're all pretty familiar with that. In terms of IDEA oversight, with weaker reinforcement of state compliance, what's going to happen? Are some states, is going to be more disparity between special education and education in general? Is going to be much more disparity in the quality of special education from one state to another? If states are not in compliance, are they going to be given technical assistance to get into compliance? Well, we're not sure, but many people feel that with less state compliance, a lot can be happening that we don't want to happen. I think a big problem is going to be the fragmentation of services. And right now we have some very good coordination. It's not perfect, but as Charlie said, the IDEA isn't perfect. We've come a long way over the years, but we still have more improvements we could make. But right now, there's fairly good coordination across, schools between federal, state, and local governments with early intervention systems, with Medicaid, vocational rehabilitation, and moving IDEA compliance over to Health and Human Services has the potential to add another layer of bureaucracy and make coordination more difficult, not easier. I think where there's going to be a big problem is with confusion for families. Right now, families know if they need some assistance, if there's a problem, if they have a complaint, they go to the Department of Education. Right now, well, if it's a complaint that comes under the IDEA, they're going to be going to Health and Human Services. If it's something under 504, they're moving to the Department of Justice. My experience, and I have to say I've been retired for several years now, but my experience is a lot of parents really don't understand the difference between the protections that children are given under Section 504 and the protections they're given under the IDEA. That being the case, they're not really going to know which department they can turn to, and they may be getting a runaround. And
Now, if I could back up under there, a good friend of ours, Suzanne Eckes, has done a great deal of work in this area. How many educators understand those distinctions? So I think we have to work on providing development services so that educational staff can point out where parents should go. What do you think?
No, I agree with that. And, I know one comment I've heard in response to where did the families go is, someone once said, well, the lawyers ought to know. Well, I think the lawyers are probably just as confused as we are right now. But also, I don't see that as an adequate response. The families themselves ought to know where to turn. And many times, many parents do try to navigate this by themselves without resorting to an attorney. Some cases, they really can't afford it. So what's going to happen? I don't know.
The goal, of course, that I just put something in the chat. I forgot completely about this as we were preparing. A little while back, I published an op-ed in the Dayton Daily News. They no longer publish op-eds. I called it Mend It, Don't End It, about these attempts at wanting to shut down the Department of Education. I don't know if I had sent it to you, Allan. One of the things that critics point out was that in 2024, the Department of Education's budget was $90 billion, and that it spends more than $1.5 billion annually for more than 4,500 employees in Washington, D.C., that the bureaucracy continues to grow while the services continue to shrink. And I think there's probably a fair amount of legitimacy in doing that. But how do we fix it? We don't want to wind up throwing the baby out with the bathwater. How do we get it to focus on its core mission of assisting children and their families? And I think that's an important thing in my mind, that school officials or educators must become partners with the parents to help parents usher their kids through the system. And again, as you said earlier, we don't have all the answers. I like to say in class, I think I've got some pretty good questions. I'll be darned if I know what the answers are. But I think if we can at least raise the right questions, we can move in the direction of trying to figure out how to deal with the morass. We certainly need some federal involvement. There's no question about it. The question is the degree to which it's done, along with adequate funding to help states and local school boards provide the services that kids and their families need. And again, here you mentioned families are going to see longer wait times, fewer investigations, higher thresholds in terms of action, burdens of proof. Parents need to understand what their rights are. And I think educators have an obligation to help them do that sort of thing, whether 504 or IDEA. But I'll give it back to you.
Yeah, most definitely. This is a good time, I think, to foster even greater coordination than we already have between parents and families. We need to work together to get through all of this. Again, I just want to reiterate what I mentioned a little earlier, that in the previous calendar year, the Office for Civil Rights in the Department of Justice had 2,700 plus complaints pending, and they didn't resolve a single one of them. These are non-education complaints. Now they're going to get all the education complaints added to that. How many of those? I really don't know. I haven't seen statistics on how many complaints the Department of Ed's Office of Civil Rights gets in a year, but I think it's fairly significant. Okay, so what's the combined impact of all of this on students themselves? First of all, I know I'm repeating or reiterating a little bit here, but there will be no single federal agency being responsible for ensuring educational access for students with disabilities. It's going to be fragmented. Monitoring, enforcement, and compliance will be very fragmented. States will have less pressure on them to meet the federal requirements. And parents will be losing a very clear, accessible pathway for complaints and enforcement. So just as a final note, these structural shifts are actively being undertaken right now by executive actions, multi-agency agreements, and there is a proposed 12 billion budget cut for K-12 education. I think we all know already there isn't enough money there, so a $12 billion budget cut is going to be substantial. However, there will be no absolute dissolution of the Department of Education unless Congress approves it. Congress has to dissolve the department. It cannot be done by executive action. The department can be dismantled, it can be dispersed, but the department will still exist. It'll still be a cabinet level position until Congress dissolves it. Right now, there are several bills being thrown around in advance that are designed to do just that. So please pay attention to this. Keep your eye on it. Read the newspapers. Read the online articles. Do whatever you have to do. Contact your professional organizations. See what information they can give. It's very confusing and it's very unsettled at the moment. Not a good way to be starting a new school year. Absolutely.
To try to put a positive spin on it, though, I think that it throws it back to the states, and some states are going to be much more aggressive in taking care of the needs of kids with disabilities. If you go back to the 1970s and 60s, some parts of the nation, Massachusetts was a leader, New York was pretty good, Pennsylvania did a decent job, but other parts of the country don't do it nearly as well. To the extent that education is a state level concern, states and local school boards have to pick up the mantle and run with it. The challenge is on them. We're together, I think, Allan. We need to keep the Federal Department of Education, but it doesn't absolve states of their key responsibility to provide education as well. So maybe they'll pick up the challenge and move from there. I see Eric's back, so maybe Eric, you want to moderate some questions or discussion, or we'll turn it back over to you. Thanks.
That sounds great. Thanks, gentlemen. That was fantastic. Lots and lots of questions that I know you probably saw coming through in the chat, but also that were submitted prior to the webinar. And you hit on, a vast majority of different buckets, so to speak. And I hope that we can have a bit of a cross section of questions throughout. And I have a tendency personally in my professional career sometimes to bury the lead, so I'm not going to do that right now. And I'm hoping that we can maybe dive right back in um, to the impact on students, right? At the end of the day, that's why we're here, and as educators, and some specific questions. The first one is related to inclusion, right? In least restrictive environment, and I know Alan, you had touched on things with regard to a more therapeutic or medical model, but could it not be the case? And curious your thoughts on with less oversight, so to speak, and maybe more, emphasis on those quote unquote pull-out services. Is there a case to be said that, looking at the other side of things, that this could maybe open up an opportunity for more opportunities for inclusion? Just kind of curious on what that maybe that trickle down might look like.
Anything's possible.
Sure.
One thing in terms of inclusion, we have a very long history of case law that basically dictates how local school districts must include students with disabilities in state assessment programs, in general education. And the way the law reads right now is very simple, that, inclusion is to be the first line, more or less. Students can be excluded only when it's absolutely necessary for them to receive the special ed services. So we have today, even when the original Education for All Handicapped Children Act was implemented, many students were still excluded from general education. The landscape was very different back in the late 70s, early 80s than it is today. And that's come about more because of court cases than anything else. And that case law is now the law of the land. So inclusion is still going to be federally mandated by the IDEA in the case law that accompanies it. I don't know whether a medical model would improve that. I'm not really sure.
Okay. Thank you.
If I could put
Um,
if
yeah,
you don't
please.
mind adding a little bit of a positive spin on it, I think to the extent that education, according to the Constitution, is a state level concern, it throws the challenge back to the states to pick up the lead and care for their kids with disabilities. The federal, the IDA, I have a book back there on the shelf someplace. About 10 years ago, I edited a comparative book. At that time, only 45 nations in the world even had statutes mandating education of kids with disabilities. And I often say when I speak overseas, as a student of the law, not as an American, even with its flaws, I think the IDA is the best statute in the world. That's not to say that a good thing couldn't be made better, but the fact that the IDEA may, and I don't know, maybe watered down a bit in DC does not absolve the states of their legal responsibility to educate children to the maximum extent possible. So if you want to take a more positive spin on it, perhaps as a challenge, I think the challenge for states is to pick it up and run and see what they can do to provide services for kids that would parallel and mirror what the IDA called for, because as it stands, they're not getting sufficient funding for what they receive anyway. So maybe they could pick up their own and develop their own programs and do an even better job. Or is that a cop out?
Well, I'm curious. I guess I'll push you a little bit, and it might be an unfair question, but I'm curious at what you're hearing, and if you're hearing anything at all around how states are planning to act, and really kind of needing to take that ownership and responsibility, both from a legal and financial standpoint, and with the fear of funding going away from at the federal level. Is there anything yet right out there across the nation with regard to, maybe some leading states or whatnot, to support this, to really pick up the slack? Again, I think we got a handful of financial and legal questions here, so we'll start there from a budget standpoint. What does that look like? What about funding formulas? Curious about that.
Trying to put a positive spin on it. And I teach in a program where we pick up students from all around the country. We're an online program, and the students themselves are very fine people. But the economy being what it is, and the economy is over my head, bluntly, I don't see a lot of money going into special ed or education. I think states, that's where they're looking to trim. And at the risk of sounding like useless aphorisms, it strikes me as kind of penny wise and pound foolish. if we're not investing in education, we're going to pay for it now or we're going to pay for it later. We should be putting the money in now, but we're not doing that. I think politicians, with all due respect, tend to think what's going to get them most elected, and education is not a high priority issue right now in elections. So I think education is going to be the redheaded stepchild for a while longer. I wish it could be more positive. As I say, I want to put a positive spin on that states will pick it up, but I don't see a groundswell of support coming there, Eric. I hope there will be, but maybe I'm missing something. What do you think, Alan?
My biggest fear is that some states are going to be able to pick it up, other states are not.
I agree with that.
And, a student with disabilities in Massachusetts and a student with disabilities in Mississippi may get a very different type of education. And to me, that's not right. Every student with disabilities should have an equal access to quality education. And are we seeing it right now? No, but we're a lot closer than we were a few years ago. And it's been getting better, not worse. But my fear is that without federal oversight of special education, a lot of things are going to slip between the cracks in terms of state compliance. Yes, I think, a lot of states will not have a problem. Again, not to brag about Massachusetts, but the Massachusetts law in many respects is more comprehensive than IDEA. So in Massachusetts, local school districts really can't back off because the state is going to be there. I'm not sure that's going to be the case everywhere. So that's my concern, is there's going to be greater inequality, not less inequality.
Dr. Osborne, just maybe one of the last questions about funding too. I know you touched on it in your presentation. The federal formula, IDEA Part B and Part C, do we have clarity on what that will look like going into now? I know some schools across the nation are back to school already, right? It's a new fiscal year. Has anything changed at this point at the state level, or excuse me, at the federal level that rolls down to states with regard to what the available funds are for this fiscal year? Is the start, with all of this going to impact things this year, or are we really looking at the future for next year?
I think, I think it's immediate,
Yeah.
but probably more so in the future. As I mentioned earlier, right now there's already a proposal to cut, $12 billion from the Department of Ed's budget. Now, not all of that $12 billion goes directly to local school districts to help them with special education. It's spread across all aspects of education, all states, all departments, and whatnot, but it's got to have an impact. I don't know about anyone else, but if you took a little bit of my budget out, it's going to change the way I run my household, what I do. I might not go out to eat as often. I might not travel as much. So yes, it will have an impact. In terms of the specific impact on special education, as Charlie had mentioned, the federal government, when it originally passed the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, basically promised to pay 40% of the excess costs, and they haven't come close. So the amount of money that local school districts are getting from the federal government is a small part of the total special education budget. But nevertheless, it's part of it. And if that money gets taken away or even lessened, who's going to make it up? Is the state going to make it up? The states are strapped for money right now too. So it can fall directly on local school districts to make up that difference, and they're already hurting.
Yeah. Thank you. And one of the things that I've always said as a former special education administrator is, my philosophy was always, can we live proactively in a reactive world where special ed we know is reactive, right? We're reacting to the needs of our students and IEPs, but how can we be strategic and proactive? There was a couple questions really with regard to teachers, educators, related service providers on their day to day. Is there anything that they can do from a, just a day to day, standpoint? Is there documentation? Is there anything that they can do just for themselves, whether that's for job security, protections, advocating for, their students and just this, all of the funding formulas and anything. Is there anything proactively that comes to mind or strategically that our educators can put into place?
I'd like to back it up and a little bit further, Eric. I'm in a bifurcated position. I have a joint appointment. I teach half of my classes in the School of Education, teaching administrators, and half in the law school. And my experience in over 30 years of teaching in higher ed is that unfortunately, K to 12 educators, through no fault of their own, really are not as literate in the ins and outs of special education as they need to be. So I think we need to back it up to undergraduate programming to
Hmm.
educate teacher candidates, administrator candidates on the value and importance not only of funding special education adequately, but providing programming for across the board. We tend to miss that. And again, Suzanne Eck is a good friend of both Allan and myself. Did research, and through her research with a couple of other people, I don't know if you knew the Dave Schimmel up at UMass, passed away since, wonderful guy. They found that principals were really woefully uneducated about the parameters of IDEA. So if they don't understand it, they really can't pass it on to the teachers. So I think we have to back it up and provide the education from, as somebody said in funding, from the bottom up. I think from the bottom up, once they get to schools, as you know well, they're so busy with just day to day. How are you going to provide the ongoing professional development? It's not to say don't provide it, but I think we have to do more in pre-service education to let it filter down through the system later. What do you think, Allan or Eric, on that?
Yeah, most definitely. And to also get back a little bit to the original question that Eric raised there in terms of, what can teachers do? One thing I would recommend is do everything you can to learn more about federal and state requirements. If you haven't taken a course in special education law, I recommend it. There are a lot of good textbooks out there. Naturally, Charlie and I are biased. We think ours is pretty good, but there are some other excellent ones out there. I could name a lot of different authors that have really got some very good textbooks on special ed law. Get one of them, read it. Uh, you know, Special ed journals such as Exceptional Children often publish articles on special ed legal issues. Uh, Read as much as you can and become as familiar with it as you can to protect yourself. Another thing I recommend, in the last webinar we did at the very end, we encourage people to vote. But today what I'd like to encourage people to do is take that one step further. Whether you like what's happening or you don't like what's happening, contact your federal reps and your senators. Let them know what you think. If you're not happy with all of this, make it very clear to them that you expect them to do something about it. And if they don't, it's going to impact your vote. You have political power, and I strongly urge you to use it.
With regard to getting, you're really coming together as a true community, right? And as a society, I appreciate both of your points there. And really, starting at the college level and the graduate, and undergrad programs and really having that robust education and knowledge. How do we translate that, to our parents and families now? There was one question that came in, wondering, are there any legal, requirements at this point, either at the state level or locally that you've heard of where these changes are now mandated. We have to be that proactive to share with our families and communities. And even if not legal, how can we as educators best go about fostering, not only that collaboration, but really breaking this down for our family members that, they didn't go to, necessarily school for education. They don't have this extensive background. What does that look like in your mind?
I think it's a two-way street in there, Eric. Good question. One of the greatest frustrations that I hear from my graduate students, and I only teach graduate students, I've never really taught undergraduates, is that parents almost don't seem interested. I've had teachers tell me that parents don't even come for IEP meetings, that they have to offer free dinners, that they have to offer raffles to get parents to come. I've often said cynically to my classes, if I want to get rich and famous and go on Oprah, the book I want to write is How to Make Parents Be Parents. So I think, educators can reach out to parents, but the parents have to be receptive.
Sure.
And I think we have to find, I'm as low tech. I think you were there when we were signing on. I had a hard time signing on, but I think educators have to work through things like social media and that sort of thing to reach out to parents and let them know what's going on. But I think it's a two-way street. Parents have to want to help their children. And I think now with so many parents working, and I'm not justifying it, they almost don't have time to meet with their children. But I think schools should offer more programs for parents and the communities to let them know what they're providing. There's regardless of one's faith or lack thereof, in the Judeo-Christian scriptures, it talks about don't put your light under a bushel basket. I think schools need to publicize the good things they're doing for these kids and encourage parents to do that as well. At the risk of rambling too much on you, because I know we're getting short on time,
Okay.
I think schools have to reach out to parents, but parents have to be willing to reach back out. And if I had the answer to that one, I'd be rich and famous, I suppose. I wish I could give you a better one for that. Alan, what do you think?
Yeah, definitely. I think schools can do a lot to help to educate parents. When I was younger, I actually used to do parent workshops. And even though I worked in the school system, I was kind of an odd duck that, I went out trying to teach parents how to deal with school districts and how to file complaints and how to act on behalf of their children and make sure their children got what they should be getting. But there are a lot of special ed parent groups or parent councils that are within school districts, and what I encourage them to do is at least once a year sponsor some sort of a symposium for parents on the laws of not just the federal laws, more importantly, probably the state laws, and teach them about what their rights are and what their responsibilities are. And that will also help to foster partnerships between schools and parents, and hopefully let the parents realize that, we're not on opposite sides of the table. We're really on the same side. We're working together.
That being the case, though, you got to get parents to want to come. I taught at Fordham University, Midtown Manhattan, between 1989 and 1992. And when I was there, I kind of inherited a contract that one of my colleagues had working with a school in New York City, or a school district in New York City. They literally paid parents, this is 89 to 92, but then I went to Kentucky, they paid parents $25 to come to meetings about their children. If you have to pay parents to come to meetings about their children, that's kind of a sorry state of events, I think. But I think we have to look for ways to reach out to get parents to be involved. And if that's what you got to do, do that. Give them tickets to a basketball game. Have a dinner for them. Do something. Wish that it weren't so, but we don't live in the time of Ozzie and Harriet anymore. If we ever did, I think we have to find parents where they are. And something that was in the chat going on, I think is very worth important noting, is that we have to, as we said before, educate pre-service teachers on the need for special education. So many educators come out and they only know their little slice of education. We got to teach them the broad spectrum of what's out there. And I hope in the hour we've been together, we've been able to shed some light on some of those issues. But as Alan said at the beginning, I think we've got some pretty good questions, but we'd be darned if we have some of the answers. But I think asking the questions puts us up in the right direction, and hopefully someday we'll get to those answers.
I'm going to fit in just one more question just to get through a cross section of each of our topics here. It's really on post-secondary and college, and curious what the impact is. One, I guess two-part question. One, for our post-secondary students, maybe our students in the 18 to 22, age programs after 12th grade, and then in college. Is there any impact there, fiscally, legally, so on and so forth, with regard to these changes?
I can tell you, at my university, University of Dayton, I am really proud of what they do in the Office of Student with Disabilities. They do everything they can. When kids come in with a request for 504 accommodation plans, they are entirely on top of it. However, I think individual faculty members, and I can't speak to Dayton because I'm not involved with it that much, but I think across the board, as I learned when I was a high school teacher, individual faculty members have to understand what services they must provide to students. A few years ago, one of my students, who was a school counselor, did a dissertation on students with disabilities in higher ed. And I think we also have to work with the students, and I hope I'm making sense, Eric. Many students with disabilities wanted to hide it. They didn't want it known that they had 504 plans. They didn't want to be ostracized. They didn't want to be looked down. I think we have to put a positive spin on it to recognize that if you have a need, it's absolutely positive to try to overcome that need. And we need to work with faculty, staff, and students. Institutionally, we do a very good job. I think, although, as you know from experience, and Allan as well, too many people go in the classroom, they close the door in the rule of their own little kingdom. They have to be educated on the needs of all their citizens, so to speak. So we could have the policies up at the high level. They have to make sure to filter through. But I think, based on my limited experience in the schools that I'm familiar with, I don't think the cuts are going to have a significant impact because we're on top of it. But I hope that's going to be true in a lot of places. And I fear it's not going to be as universal as the rosy picture I'm painting where I am. But I can only tell you that I'm pleased with what we do here. Allan, what do you think? Massachusetts, I think, will be good. States like
I think they will. The concern I do have is that right now, with court cases, court complaints that are filed under 504 on behalf of students, probably about half of the ones I see today, at least the published ones, are for students in higher education, not necessarily K to 12, because that's the protection they have. They don't have an equivalent law like the IDEA. And not every student who files a lawsuit wins. Not every student is right in what they're claiming. But the fact is that every student deserves to have the opportunity to hear their concerns aired and to have their day in court, more or less. And right now, I'm concerned that may not be happening.
Gentlemen, yeah, go ahead, Dr. Russo.
30 seconds up here. Just like yesterday morning, I had a doctor visit, just a regular checkup. Everything is fine. But my doctor's son had a serious eye condition. He had to get some kind of special contact. I don't quite understand it. But I suggested to him, and he said, it's a good thought. I said, you might want to ask for Section 504 accommodations, at least while he has that special contact in. And he had mentioned that nobody in the school system had mentioned that to him. And I live in a better school system. I live in an upper SES community where parents are aware of their rights. So I think educators have to work with parents to get that word out as well. I know that's kind of a PS to what we said earlier, but I think that applies whether K-12 or higher ed. Trying to put a positive spin on it, I'm hoping states will pick up on it. But if you really believe that, when we go offline, stick around. I have a part-time job as a salesman. There's this Bridge in Brooklyn that's on sale. I could give you a good price on it. I hope we can end on a positive note that it'll go there, but I'm apprehensive where it's going to go. Yeah. Maybe we could revisit in a year and see how it sounds then.
Dr. Osborne, any final thoughts on that or anything else before we wrap?
Well, to go on with Charlie and wanting to end on a positive note, I think what I would like to say is I am concerned about the Department of Education being broken up and its responsibilities dispersed. But that is the situation we had before the Department of Education was formed in 1979. Somehow we survived it. The one thing I know about special education teachers is that they are resilient. They're the best. And they're going to get through this, and they're going to do the best they can for the kids in front of them. And because of that, I'm not as concerned about the kids as I am about the teachers themselves. Your job may get more difficult, but I know you'll come through.
Thank you for that. I appreciate it. I think that we did end on a positive note, or at least a hopeful one. And to your point, certainly all the participation in the chat today and everyone's, attendance today, is a testament to the emotion I know we're all feeling and really the passion and dedication that we have to the profession. And Dr. Osborne, Dr. Russo, I really appreciate your time, your expertise.
I actually sent the suggestion in earlier. I just did it just this afternoon here at my university. I did a session with regular ed teachers on negligence and inadequate supervision of students. So I said, Ashley, I think a topic that might be worthwhile exploring is adequate supervision of kids with disabilities because the standards are going to be higher. And I think she's interested in that. So perhaps later this year, we'll come back together on that. But thank you for the opportunity to be here. I hope we made some sense. Let me leave everybody with a smile. A couple of weeks ago, my wife and I came back from Australia with our granddaughters. Do you know what you call a boomerang that doesn't work? A stick.
Love it. Love it. Thank you for that. Thank you for that laugh. We need to try to do our best to bring
Eric,
joy to each other. So thank you,
right,
Dr.
Eric, if
Russo.
you're smart, you'll put him on mute.
Ha!
Well,
No, it's all
like
good.
that
Keep them
one.
coming.
If you like that, what's a kangaroo's favorite music? Hip hop.
This is good for my dad joke repertoire. I appreciate it.
But while I'm ahead.
Well, to everyone who's joined us this evening, NASET will be sending out the webinar recording along with your certificate of attendance by the end of tomorrow. So please keep an eye out for your inbox. Certainly, Dr. Osborne, Dr. Russo, hope that you have the opportunity to come back. We weren't able to get through all of the questions that were asked. We know it's a robust and pressing conversation, so thank you again. As a reminder to everyone, NASET members always receive 15% off of all board certification courses and PD offerings. If today inspired you or energized you, NASET would love to support your continued growth. The NASET professional development credits are accepted in most states and districts across the country. I know that's been a huge point of emphasis for NASET. They've done a really great job with recognizing professional development credits throughout the country. And August isn't over yet. We know school's back for some of us, but we still have a lot of summer to go. NASET has two more incredible webinars this month. So if you are not a member yet, we hope that you'll join. On August 20th, NASET hosts an exclusive member-only webinar. Focuses on AI tools for math and special education, practical and accessible ways to use AI to support math instruction for students with disabilities. That will be hosted by Dr. Crystal Mary, who's a lecturer in special ed at the University of Maine at the College of Education and Human Development. She spent over a decade as a math educator, and she'll walk through the latest AI tools for math education and special ed. And then closing out the month of August, on August 25th, NASET will host another member exclusive session with Dr. Ross Green, the founding director of Lives in the Balance, a New York Times bestselling author of The Explosive Child, and an adjunct associate professor at Virginia Tech. Dr. Green will present Kids Do Well If They Can, Rethinking Concerning Behavior in Special Education with the Collaborative and Proactive Solutions, or CPS model, exploring how this model can help educators better understand and effectively respond to concerning behaviors in students with disabilities. On behalf of everyone at NASET, thank you so much for the work you do every day. We truly do appreciate it. Hang in there, but to support students with disabilities and professionals who serve them. Thanks so much for showing up today, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks, everyone.
Eric, thanks. You can stick around a second?
Yes, sir.